Welcome to Protect, Suicide Prevention Training Podcast for Healthcare Professionals. I'm Manaan, Consultant Psychiatrist, Founder, and Head of Faculty at Progress Guide. Warm welcome to our listeners. Hope you're having a good weekend. Today I am here with Stan Steindl. You would have heard him in April 2022, about 2.5 years back, about motivational interviewing. In that episode, we talked a lot about how therapists, people, mental health professionals could spend time rolling with the ambivalence that a person experiencing suicidal distress as an essential skill of somehow helping them move towards change. And it was a wonderful episode in which Stan and we kind of explored that in detail. Stan is someone I respect deeply. I've attended his motivational interviewing training, and let me tell you, he practices MI all the way through the training. So everything that he does, he actually lives and breathes MI in the training. And I was listening recently, a couple of months back, I think, to one of his podcasts with Paul Gilbert, the founder of Compassion Focused Therapy. And I could hear him summarizing Paul Gilbert as he was going along using MI strategies. And if you haven't attended one of Stan's training, you are missing out. So find a way to get into one of his trainings. I found it incredibly informative. And from a practice point of view, it has helped me immensely. Stan's in private practice, and he's also an adjunct associate professor at UQ School of Psychology, has supported set up the Compassion Mind Research Group. He's also a TEDx speaker and a very respected author, and has an awesome channel on YouTube called Compassion in a T-shirt. So that is what I'm really curious about. I'm curious about the name. But I thought, given this is Australia's first Loneliness Awareness Week, who better to approach than Stan, an expert on compassion, self-compassion and compassion towards others. Research has now shown that 1 in 3 Australians are living in loneliness, and 1 in 6 are living with severe loneliness. And I kept thinking, who might be a person who is really good for this week's session, and no one better than Stan could fill that gap. So Stan, welcome.
Manaan, thank you very much. What a delightful introduction. I really appreciate your words, and we actually have an MI workshop coming up this coming Thursday, Friday with Metro South. So yes. That's still rolling along. And also your words there about loneliness are very, very moving. It's a large numbers, isn't it? Really, I suppose I hadn't really kind of thought of it in those stark terms, but yeah. So but yeah, thank you very much for having a chance to chat with you.
Yeah, compassion in a T-shirt, though, Stan. Why the name, and what does it indicate? Compassion in a T-shirt.
Yeah, it's. I'm pleased we're starting there, because Compassion in a T-shirt is my YouTube channel. But just in the last week, I think really, I have spun that out into a podcast as well, and so people can both watch. If they prefer watching, they can do that on the YouTube channel, or if they like to listen while they drive or do their chores or something, then it's also available like that. But the idea really, it's twofold in a way. One is that sometimes people can have certain fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. It can feel very woo-woo, or it can feel very warm and fuzzy, or it might feel too much like self-pity, or there's a range of kind of fears, blocks, and resistances that might arise. And so I was really trying to think about being able to present the concepts of compassion and self-compassion, but in a plain language kind of way, a way that really relates to the practicalities of it all. And that is, like, may I be helpful to myself and others, rather than harmful, I guess is the idea. So it's sort of in a t-shirt because it's really just, meant to be that very plain language, practical approach. And the other thing too is sometimes compassion is seen in the realms of something more spiritual or philosophical or kind of highbrow even. And so, yeah, again, just trying to kind of present, I think, what is a really important topic in a way that people can sort of digest and that sort of thing. So the idea of compassion in a t-shirt was born. In fact, I'm wearing one of my compassion t-shirts today.
Yes, indeed, indeed. I want one of those. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Brilliant,
So
brilliant.
I felt very clever. I created that on Canva, and but anyway, so yeah, that's the idea there. Thanks.
Oh, that's brilliant. Like, I actually went through my bookshelf and found the book, The Compassionate Mind. This was actually a gift from a team member who I also looked after. And when I got the book, it's kind of, he wrote inside it to Manaan, to help you find your compassionate mind. And then he wrote, thanks for all your help, advice, plus compassion, stay connected. And then he said, your best
Mm,
ever patient. And he wrote the patient in big bold letters. And it didn't kind of make
yes.
sense because I had not read, this must be 2010, 11, very early days that the book had come out. Till and we worked together as well. So he kind of knew that there is actually a very harsh voice in my head, set very high standards for myself and my team. And and it took a while for it to click what he meant by saying to help you find your compassionate mind. Yeah, so that was my first exposure. Uh, and it's about, I would say, 13, 14 years back. And I went looking for the book and found the book.
Mm,
And it is a beautiful read. A bit thick nowadays, given our ability to focus and concentrate is that of a goldfish. But it was a wonderful read at that time, just kind of reading through things which seemed very natural, at least for those of us who have been trained in the helping professions, but profoundly difficult to actually put into practice. Whether that be the training that we go through, like as a being trained as a medic, part of the training is this idea that you should know better. Uh, you must do better. I remember small, simple mistakes from the early days of my medical career, where that an error of a decimal point here or there, or the decimal point in the medication dose is not seen. A patient can actually die because you did not put the decimal point down properly. Those things kind of stick in your head, right? And that's almost part of our training. And recently, last year for World Suicide Prevention Day, I published a book called Healing for Healers, in which kind of how do you heal after you have lost a patient to suicide. And in that, we were recounting things around mindfulness and compassion towards oneself. Like, do we show ourselves the same compassion that we want to show our patients? We are often in a situation like that. We are hurting, and it's difficult. It's difficult for staff who have lost someone to suicide. So
mm,
I guess compassion in a t-shirt. And for our listeners, if you haven't listened to Stan's podcast or to his YouTube channel, just Google it, the compassion in a t-shirt. It will come up. It will come straight up. I would strongly, strongly recommend to some of, and he's got some awesome guests, both from CFT and from an MI world, actually. So I'll strongly, strongly recommend it. So,
mm.
Stan, I was wondering whether we could start with the real basics of compassion focused therapy. So, given our listeners to the Suicide Prevention podcast may not have been exposed to CFT at all, and my knowledge is fairly rudimentary. It would be quite helpful if we can begin right from the very basics of what is CFT, or compassion focused therapy.
Great. Yeah. Well, the book you're referring to, The Compassionate Mind, is it's the sort of the seminal work really of Professor Paul Gilbert, who is the founder of CFT. And it's interesting how you use the word natural, around compassion, because I suppose the central premise from Paul and in The Compassionate Mind is that compassion has evolved. It's an evolved adaptive quality or attribute of human beings that we really survived by looking after each other. And so CFT is kind of an evolutionary based biopsychosocial model of the mind, really. It draws on evolutionary theory, but also Paul's genius is in the way that he's integrated evolutionary theory with psychological theory and attachment theory and the neuroscience and a whole the wisdom traditions, a whole range of different elements. He's brought them all together to help us understand our own minds. One of the things that he really focused on at the beginning was exactly what you were referring to, self-criticism and shame. And he found early on, he was a big cognitive behavioral therapy person, although he'd been trained in quite a number of approach, but he found clinically that in CBT, people were often able to challenge and change their thoughts, but the new thoughts would still come along with a very critical tone. So, for example, they might be able to say that, perhaps they do have friends or people that care about them, but they would say, of course you do, don't be ridiculous. Of course you have friends, or something like that. So he became very interested in tone, first of all, the tone of our inner voice, I guess you could say, and the tone of our self to self relating. And initially he was really trying to help people cultivate a more caring tone in the way that they approach themselves, to try to combat the self-criticism, but also the resulting shame and depression and so on. And then gradually, as he developed the model, he moved more towards this notion of compassion and a compassionate tone. So CFT really is, there's psychoeducational elements, which is all about helping people to understand the tricky brain, as he would say, the evolved brain, and all of the different elements that comes along with that, and many elements of which can cause us a lot of suffering, actually. And so there's those psychoeducational elements to it, and then there's certain compassionate mind training elements to it, which is what your patient or colleague was sort of saying to you. We can do that. We can really, there are practical steps we can take to actually cultivating our own compassionate mind, cultivating a kind of a compassionate self, in a way, that part of us, or that version of us, that we can bring to suffering, or bring to the suffering of others, certainly as well, but also bring to our own suffering, our self-criticism, our shame, anxiety, anger, sadness, and so on. And so that's really the goal through psychoeducation and compassionate mind training, that people are able to bring that compassionate part to themselves.
Yeah, like what you were talking about, you change the thoughts, you catch the thoughts and you change the thoughts, but the thoughts come back a kind of old rum in a new bottle, in a way. I'm kind of reminded of a video in which we have got this of someone who is an administrative person who is typing, right? But clearly she's someone who used to use a typewriter, right? So she's typing, and most young people won't get this joke because they haven't actually seen a typewriter, but she's just typing, and then suddenly she whacks the monitor with her left hand, and then the kind of the monitor flies off the desk. You go, oh, what happened? So kind of the moral of this is that you can teach an old dog new tricks, but you cannot make an old dog forget their old tricks. And as you were saying that, it reminded me of that little kind of 1 minute video clip that I've got, which we often use in our Protect training to remind people that if we are going to make practice change, it's important not just to take in the knowledge, but not to go back to old ways of practicing. But very difficult if you have got that harsh voice in your head.
Yes,
you suddenly have
that's right.
A different type.
And it's so tricky because the change is difficult, and sometimes I think for the younger listener, I guess the metaphor is that she was used to the old typewriters where you had to push the thing aside every time you went down a line. Goodness, that is going a little while back. But instead, she did it with the computer monitor, I suppose. And so change is very difficult, and changing that self to self relating is very difficult as well, and trying to soften the tone and so on. And the irony, of course, is that what happens is when we have trouble changing the tone, and when we start to notice ourselves being critical of ourselves again, we then double down and we become critical of ourselves being critical. And then we start to get these layers of self-criticism, and we feel frustrated with ourselves for finding change difficult. So, and that is it. That's why we think of, we have these tricky brains, because they have all of these sort of functions built in, really.
There is something I want to ask you, and this may be a slightly more advanced question than what I intended to. I wanted to do an episode just getting to the foundations, the basics of CFT. But I have often wondered, because psychoeducation is such a big part of CFT. And one of the key things that I took out of your MI training was, the one thing that the therapist doesn't do is take the expert position, having the answers, providing education. Now, as someone who is a highly experienced MI trainer, and someone who is a highly experienced person practicing CFT, how do you square the two? How in a session would you actually do some psychoeducation without coming across like one thing that stuck with me, has stuck with me since the time I attended your training, is that the patient must have all the best lines. Like the person you are doing therapy with must have the best lines. So how do you practice? How do you square the psychoeducation component of CFT, in which you talked about, whether that be the tricky brain or the wise brain, whichever therapeutic modality you use, where we are trying to explain a concept to a patient while practicing in an MI way with, open questions and reflections and summarizing. How do you do that? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of sort of apparent rub, isn't it, there, in a way, between the MI and the CFT. Although I think Paul Gilbert would say, and a lot of us practicing CFT would sort of really try to still use a guided discovery approach, where we're still being evocative. I mean, the classic example, which is where we often might begin with CFT, actually, is what is compassion? And it's interesting. It's an interesting question, I think, for all of us, really, because there's a lot of many and varied views on how we might define compassion. But that would be a good example where it's psychoeducational in nature, but we begin by asking and exploring. For example, we might explore who was a compassionate person in your life, for example, and what sorts of qualities might that person have had, or what are the certain competencies or skills or actions that the person might have taken. And so sometimes people are able to identify a compassionate person in their life, a teacher or a coach or a grandparent maybe, and so they can sometimes start to explore in their own mind what makes that person compassionate to them. Or sometimes people unfortunately don't have a person like that they can recall in their lives. So we might move to characters in films, or we might move to spiritual or religious notions of what compassion might be, or so we try to move about and tap into little examples from them of what compassion might be. We also will often use memories. It can sometimes be really nice to explore memories of the person being compassionate towards others and trying to tap into that. Like when you were being compassionate there, maybe it's just a small thing, a small act of kindness or small act of compassion. What did you notice in the body? What did you notice about your facial expression? What were your voice tones as if you were speaking during that? Or what were the sorts of things you were trying to do or trying to say? Or, what were you bringing to that moment to be effective, and so on? So we're using examples from the person's life or memories from the person's life or other ways in to gradually explore and elaborate upon what compassion even is. And then every now and then, of course, as you know, in MI too, we might sort of say, do you mind if I just add one other little bit that I'd be curious to hear what you think about? In this approach, we really think about empathy and sympathy as being competencies of compassion. What are your thoughts there? Tell us about your thoughts about empathy and its role in compassion, or sympathy. And so it's a guided discovery. So every now and then, with permission, we might still be asking more directional questions like that. In fact, I was talking to Paul Gilbert about MI in compassion focused therapy. And as you will remember, we have change talk and sustain talk in motivational interviewing. And he coined the term wisdom talk in CFT, that what we're evoking is the client's own wisdom around what is compassion, or the sort of the tricky brain, or things to do with the threat system or the drive system or the soothing system, or we're trying to evoke that wisdom talk, gradually guiding them through, shaping it up, coming to a shared understanding of some of those topics.
Yeah, no, that was a great example. Those questions were a really good example of guided discovery. So for some of our listeners who haven't heard the previous episode with Stan, Stan talks about how MI is directional, not directive. And these questions are such beautiful examples of just exploring that guided discovery, little nudges, taking the person to explore, okay, what memories do you have, or a person in your life, or even film characters where you saw compassion, and then helping the person come find their truth in a way, amidst all the multiple realities, helping them find their truth. So beautiful example of guided discovery over there. So Stan, is that how you would open a session, trying to gain an understanding of what the person in CFT, how the person conceptualizes compassion for themselves? Would that be in MI, there are those 4 processes, and all the way from engaging to evoking change talk, and or there are particular skills, the O skills, So how would you open a session, like someone in the first session of compassion focused therapy? Would that be the goal, to try and get an understanding of their so the therapist to gain an understanding of the person's understanding of compassion? Is that something like a therapeutic goal initially?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the early goals, kind of trying to understand what is compassion, arriving at a definition of sorts. So in CFT, compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. So that's kind of the definition of compassion. And you can see in there that actually self and others is right in the definition. So we're really starting to think about the 3 flows of compassion: compassion for others, receiving compassion from others, and self-compassion. And actually, quite a lot of people will be more familiar with, but also much more comfortable with being compassionate towards others. Being open to receiving compassion is harder. It's harder because it triggers off certain, concerns. We worry about how we'll be seen in the minds of others, and we worry that being open to receiving compassion may make us look weak, or may make us look sort of needy, or dependent, or incompetent. All sorts of possibilities that people might worry about. And self-compassion too is tricky. People often worry that that's too much like self-pity, or too self-indulgent, or too selfish, really, I guess. So we try to explore the definition of compassion, the three flows, for others, from others, and for self. And then we start to, right from the start, we're keeping an eye out for the fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion that start arising. People worry about it. They might have fears around self-compassion. It might actually kind of literally trigger a bit of an anxiety response, or an avoidance kind of response, or they might feel blocked. Like, I don't have time for self-compassion will be a common block, or they might be resistant. They might be like, well, no, I'm trying to, I'm trying to make money here. They're more in a competitive mode or motive, rather than a compassionate or caring motive, and so they resist compassion in that sense. So there's fears, blocks, and resistances across all three flows. And so right from the start, we're trying to break it down a little bit like that, to understand what compassion is, understand the three flows, keeping an eye out for the fears, blocks, and resistances, and then starting to even broaden out a little bit from there. For example, sensitivity, sympathy, distress tolerance, empathy, non-judgment, care for well-being. These are all competencies that we might start to develop as we go along the compassionate mind. So that might be a really early phase. Another really early phase is more of the tricky brain stuff. There's the 3 circles model that you're probably aware of.
Before you move on to that, like, I just wanted to mention, in your TED talk, you talk about your daughter and kind of your own journey with compassion. And you talk about your mother bringing you a glass of chocolate milk. If people haven't listened to that TED Talk, people should listen to it. I think it's a really, really good summary of someone's lived experience of compassion, and you share it in a very nice kind of story-like format. And you mentioned that people who are in helping professions, psychologists, psychiatrists, we often have a lot of blocks ourselves. And at that stage in your life, you were in that caring role for your, for the apple of your eye who was suffering. How can you show yourself self-compassion? And then, but your mother persisted, reaching out to you with compassion and, not just checking in with you as to how you're doing. Of course, you had the brave face on, doing fine, but then also reaching out through actions, giving you a glass of chocolate milk. And I know you kind of do it in a bit of tongue-in-cheek, say you're a fan of chocolate milk. But at the moment, there was something in that moment which managed to, when you accepted that chocolate milk and you felt better for accepting it, it was something that broke through that block that was there. And we see that often with burnout in carers. When we work with families of people who have got someone who is suffering from a severe depression or a psychotic illness, and they are in a caring role, and they keep it together for long periods of time. And strangely, what we often get to see is that their lives fall apart when the person that they were caring for improves. And suddenly, I don't know, there's something about their breathing space or whatever it is that happens, where suddenly the burnout that they have had comes to the surface. And as we were talking, and I was thinking, I wonder whether there is something that we can do in that space where we are explicit. We have like these single session family therapy work that we do with families, and whether we should be building in a compassion component explicitly. I think it does exist implicitly around caring for oneself. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You know, um, how do you care for yourself? But a lot of the people who are doing these single session family work, they are not trained in CFT, so they most probably we haven't got the training or the skill set to be looking out for those blocks that are there or the resistance to compassion. And it is actually quite convenient for us as health professionals to accept what they are saying for what they are saying. So if they are saying, I'm okay, actually, it's really, really convenient for me as a not to have to dig deep into their state of mind, because that would be another added something to deal with. You know, I'm not saying that that happens as a conscious force, but at an unconscious level, there is a bias towards, yeah, they're doing all right. I don't need to open another Pandora's box. But I wonder whether there is a piece of work. It just kind of triggered a thought, random thought in my head as he was saying.
Mm,
Because I remember your TED talk. It's
yeah.
how you were resistant to compassion and then finally gave
Yes,
in
absolutely.
and we're better for it.
Mm. Yes, no, it's an interesting example from my mother in a way because yes, I was very concerned about Freya, my daughter, and her health, and she was only a baby at the time, and so on. And I was, as you say, very focused on compassion or just sort of trying to care for her. But Mum would say to me, you know, like, how are you? And I would say, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm all right. But of course it was very challenging and very difficult. But the sort of the banter about the chocolate milk really there's something in that though too because there's a lot of wisdom that we draw on with compassion, isn't there? It's sort of it's wise, skillful compassion, and the thing that was wise and skillful from her was her knowledge of me and you know not ways in, I guess, you know that was the key. And so it's interesting if you think about that in a more clinical scenario, you know, like what are the ways in? How do we bring that sort of wisdom and skillfulness to the compassion for the carer, for example? And because they'll be feeling the same way. They'll be like, no, I'm fine, you know, like I just got to, I'm doing it, and I, you know, um, and so there's a really and there's a lot of identity too, I suspect, that gets caught up in that as the
Mm,
carer and that sort of thing.
mm,
This is where MI comes to CFT, I think, because in some ways people will be feeling ambivalent about self compassion in that moment because they feel very committed to compassion for their loved one and they feel ambivalent about whether they've got the time or resources and so on to be compassionate towards themselves. And so I would usually spend a little bit of time just exploring those fears, blocks, and resistances, you know, just sort of saying, what are some of the reservations that you have about self care or self compassion, or what are some of the things that get in the way or the barriers? And, you know, that's a little bit like exploring sustained talk, really, in
mm,
MI. You know, we're
mm,
just exploring those fears, blocks, and resistances, giving the person a voice to be able to express that, to feel heard and understood about those various arguments against self-compassion and all of that sort of thing. And then when the person is kind of maybe we get a sense that they're feeling that we get them, they're feeling sort of understood and so on, then we might sort of tilt towards the change talk side, I guess, you know. So given all of that, and I see what you mean, it is very, very difficult to find the time or the energy for yourself and for self-care. What about the other side? What might be some of the benefits of self-compassion, or what might make self-compassion kind of important for you now? And if you were to do some self-compassionate things in your life or self-care things in your life, how would you go about it? So you can sort of hear the MI questions are brought to this same dilemma with people, and sometimes again evoking and guided sort of discovery and so on, people often can come to the conclusion of little things they can do that might just help create balance. I mean, I think that's the key, isn't it? Because if we are out of balance across the three flows of compassion, then we are at risk of fatigue or burnout and so on. If we get the balance right, then we can maintain that or sustain that sort of, into the future and so on. So it's you did the you can't pour from an empty cup, and the other one is the classic the flight attendant who says you apply the oxygen mask to yourself before helping others. There's a few little examples there. And Jack Cornfield, who's a Buddhist psychologist, one of his ones is if your compassion doesn't include yourself, then it's incomplete. So that's another little one that we can sometimes explore with people as well. Like, what do you think of that? What do you think of that saying? What does that mean for you? And we often will go back to the definition. Compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. So there's all these little ways in, I think, but ultimately we're helping people to explore their ambivalence there again. The fears, blocks and resistances, all of those reservations of the sustained talk, and the benefits, the motivations, the reasons and so on, the facilitators of self-compassion. That's the change talk side.
Yeah, yeah. Again, like the more you speak, the more we have designed an entire safety conversation based on, you might remember in the suicide prevention work that we do, it's called Protect. We talk a lot about relational safety, how the relationship provides the scaffolding within which you can make change happen. So we have got tools there's a tool called 127, what might happen in the next hour, the next 2 days, and the next 7 days. And the questions are very, very simple, like how are you going to get back home, right? So the first hour questions, what will be waiting for you there? Have you got everything you need? So those questions really are around, well, they're trying to, what we call empathy in action, trying to kind of show that you genuinely care about the person who has turned up in the emergency department and now you're sending them home. It's 11 p.m. at night. How are you going to get back home? Showing that genuine concern. How are you going to, what's going to be waiting for you there? There are people who have attended emergency department after cutting themselves, and there may be blood over there or empty packets from an overdose that they have taken. And just making that extra call for someone to clean up that place shows that you genuinely care. So when I was listening to your TED talk, in my mind, your mother reaching out with that glass of milk to me was that phone call one of our practitioners might make to the husband or someone just to check that, hey, have we cleared that space? Because that might be quite triggering if the person goes back and finds all that stuff over there again. So we put in a lot of thought into our clinical practice. How are we compassionate towards a person in distress? And I just wonder, we might need to do the same in perhaps for our family members, but also for our staff who are reaching out with compassion towards a person, but are not so great at self-compassion themselves, because whether that be the years of training they have been in, or compassion is weakness, or whatever theory kind of rules their mind, whatever truths we tell ourselves, it feels like a space in which there's a lot of work to do, particularly for staff and when we are working with families as well. But can we hit pause and rewind back to that place where you were just going to talk about the second thing? So you kind of talked about CFT and how you will explore compassion and the blocks and resistances that exist, and you're keeping an eye out for that. That's kind of one area. And then you were going to talk about, I guess, the overlap of the rational mind and the emotional, different terminology, but we kind of trying to say the same thing, I guess, in some shape or form. So you were just going to talk about that.
Yeah, no, good. I'd like to talk about that, because I think it does become really relevant here as well. Just to respond to something, what you were just saying, I interviewed a fellow called Dr. Steve Tresiak from America just recently, and he and a co-author have written a book, Wonder Drug. And the wonder drug is compassion, because and he makes the point that sometimes it might just take 40 seconds of your time to actually do that little bit of something more that means the world of difference for the person that you're working with. And it might even just be a look or a smile, or it might be that little bit of kind of physical touch on the shoulder, or maybe it might be something more practical, as you're saying, like to be able to understand what the person's going home to, and maybe making a few calls and just sort of doing that little bit extra. So I think there's really something really important in what you're saying there.
It's funny you say that. So we run, so there's in the suicide prevention training, there's an entire chapter called Empathy in Action. And in that, there is a conversation called the pain relief conversation. And we run it as a speed dating exercise, right? So there are kind of 5 people, you say it 5 times and you hear it 5 times. So 1 minute in, a bell goes and you move to the next person and you say the same words again. And then after 5 times, you kind of switch over. And the words are very simple, so it's things like, it was a good idea to seek help. It was a good idea because doing this by yourself is very difficult. It takes courage to keep up the fight. Who would not want to reduce pain? After all, who wants more pain in their life? So your desire to take your life stems from the fact that, you are thinking of every possible way to reduce that pain. I would like to get a thorough understanding of that emotional pain that you're struggling with, because if I could get an understanding of that, then we could begin to chip away at that pain or improve your tolerance to it. Takes about 40 seconds to say, and together I'm confident we'll discover hope. And so I've just come back from Malaysia, where we were running a 5-day training program, and we ran this. And of course, people who are Malay speakers or Mandarin speakers, the words feel clunky because they are not used to doing therapy in English. But the overall feedback was that was the best part of that 5-day training that we did, was just giving me some words through which they were saying, I feel that, but I haven't got the words to articulate that empathy towards that person and reach out in that way. And I genuinely feel, as a psychiatrist, very time pressured, I make it a point, maybe not saying all of them, but using those phrases. It was a good idea to seek help. It takes courage to keep up the fight. And I find in the room that the rapport deepens as soon as I have said that. It goes to the next layer of rapport. And it's so simple to take a moment to kind of say that.
Yes. No, we often feel blocked by time, or lack of time, I should say. On the other hand, it need not take actually that much time. In fact, it might not take any time at all, because you might be saying those words as you're also taking a blood pressure or changing a bandage, or I'm not sure, but it might not actually
you
take
talk
more
about
time.
tone of voice. You talk a lot about tone of voice, because that doesn't take any time.
That doesn't take time. So you might give any sort of feedback or results even, or sort of your prescribing, or there could be any moments where a shift in tone might be the thing that creates that effect. So I really, I appreciate the sort of the training that you're doing there. The next bit that comes in with CFT, I suppose, is it's sort of relevant to all of this, and it really does try to help people cultivate a kind of a mind awareness, I suppose. We're trying to help people have an awareness of their own minds by sort of through what we call the 3 circles model. As you say, it's got a lot of crossover with other sort of models and approaches and so on, but it's a nice model. It focuses on the threat system, which is one of the circles, and that's the fight, flight, freeze, appease kind of system. And it really relates to anger and anxiety, but also disgust. It's all about threat protection and safety seeking. That's the motive of the threat system is threat protection and motive seeking. And of course, it's very quick to react. So, we have that better to be safe than sorry kind of brain. And so the classic one is, like you're on a bushwalk and all of a sudden, oh, a snake. And then it's kind of like, oh, no, it's just a stick sort of thing. Our first thing is to see threats. So we have the threat system, but we also have the drive system. The drive system is more about wanting, pursuing, obtaining, succeeding, competing. It has emotions more along the lines of excitement or pleasure or those sorts of things. But it's tricky as well. We can sometimes get caught up in in hedonic adaptation or the hedonic treadmill, where even when we do succeed or even when we do acquire something that we want, we just want more. And obviously Apple and other places have worked that out, because you keep getting the new iPhone or the new pair of shoes or the new boat or whatever it might be that you're interested in. So the drive system's tricky as well. And of course, when we do have disappointments or we do fail, then we fall a bit out of drive system and back into threat system. And so, and actually self-criticism is probably really arising in the threat system. But we were also not big enough to always fight off threats. We weren't necessarily quick enough to run away from threats or whatever. We also needed each other. And this is the third circle, where we evolved to look after each other, to protect each other, to nurture each other, to feel safe together, I guess. I mean, in some ways, that's to do with our vulnerable offspring, or it was sort of born a bit prematurely. Our babies really can't do very much compared to other mammals that seem to be born much more functional than we are, and so we had to look after our babies. But this is called the soothing affiliative system. So we have the soothing system. It's about affiliation. It's about connection and closeness and feeling safe and calm together. And often we spend a lot of time in threat system, or maybe in threat and drive. Your example of the decimal point from earlier, wanting to making sure you're putting the decimal point in the right place. That's a bit of a threat-based drive state, isn't it? Like you're driven, but behind that is this worry about what would happen if you were to get it wrong. And a lot of us operate in that threat-based drive, kind of perfectionism, high standards. Maybe procrastination gets in there a bit sometimes too with threat and drive system. And so quite often in CFT, we're moving towards the soothing affiliative system. How can we activate that? That's the green circle in CFT. And so that's when we start to sort of, the mind awareness bit is being able to be aware of what system is activated or what systems are activated, and how can we make a shift towards activating soothing system.
So what questions might you ask to help a person be more aware of, am I working from the threat system? Am I working from the drive system? Or am I working in the soothing system? What are the kind of things you might ask a person which would kind of raise their level of awareness around it once they have got an understanding of the model? I'm assuming that's also part of that psychoeducation that you are doing in terms of their understanding of it. And then what kind of questions do you leave them with so that they can quickly gauge where I am at the moment?
Well, we might do a kind of a spider diagram, which sounds a bit strange actually if we're exploring threat system. But a spider diagram is where we might draw up on the board sort of, threat system might be in the middle, and then we might start to explore, so what are some of the feelings of the threat system, and is it sort of anger or anxiety, and if it's anger, is it irritability or annoyance, or is it anger, or is it rage, or is it fury or something like that? So we might explore the sort of the extent of feelings. And then we might explore thoughts. What are the thoughts that go along when you're deep in your threat system? Perhaps the what if thoughts, or, the various other sorts of things that we might recognize with angry thoughts or anxious related thoughts. Then we might explore physical sensations. Beginning to notice what are the physical sensations of threat system, the body posture, the facial expression, like how does it arise in the body? Then we might explore behavioral urges. When you're in that threat system, what are some of the urges that you have in terms of what threat system would really like to do in those moments? And then the next one might be attention. Where does your attention go? Like in the threat system, often the attention narrows and focuses in on threat, and can we sort of explore all of that? And then the last one, which is sort of the big one in CFT, it's trying to understand the motivation behind the system that you're in. What's the motive there of threat system? Now, the reason we try to get there is that when a person is sort of really threat system activated, we want them to connect to the idea that that's just their evolved brain. That's just their evolved brain doing what it was designed to do, which is to, kind of threat protection and safety seeking. That makes sense. And the key thing there with CFT is it's not your fault. So your threat system activation and the threat protection and safety seeking motivation, that's not your fault. That's how the brain was designed. The brain was designed for us, not by us, by evolution. And so, importantly, we sort of move into it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So we're trying to distinguish, kind of fault in terms of blaming or shaming from responsibility or opportunity to learn about the mind, to understand the mind, to develop some practices which might be able to help us down-regulate threat and shift across to soothing system. Because soothing system also has feelings, thoughts, physical sensations, behavioral urges, where does the attention go, and certain motivations. The motivation, of course, there is a caring motivation.
So that in CFT, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Kind of sounds a bit like the dialectics in DBT that you talk about. I'm doing my best, but I can still do better. Seemingly opposing things coming together, but I guess not opposing over here. But how do you make someone shift from that threat system to the soothing system, though? Because as you were saying earlier in the talk, I guess recognition is one thing, and the threat system gets triggered, the amygdala gets triggered by whether that be a branch that you're mistaken as a snake or someone being compassionate towards you, and then that brings up threat perception from whatever early childhood or recent domestic violence, like something triggers you, and that brings it up. So, and your threat system's activated. How do you get the soothing system to come in and perhaps douse those fires that the threat system has risen?
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, that's when we move, I think, to the compassionate mind training. And the compassionate mind training really begins, and again, these are, like I said at the start, the beauty of Paul is the way that he integrates, a lot of stuff that we know. So if anyone's curious about CFT or would like to learn about it, you'll actually find that there's a lot that you already know that we all bring to CFT. And so, for example, we might begin with body-based practices, and that might involve creating upright but relaxed body postures, and creating warm, friendly facial expressions, and really trying to work with that tone, the inner voice tones. We really practice that, and the soothing rhythm breathing. So we try to use body-based practices to slow down the mind, slow down the body. There's a lovely saying, a colleague from the UK, Deborah Lee, says, a calm mind thinks differently. And I think there's something really powerful in that. If we can calm the mind, calm the body, create even a feeling of safeness, warmth and safeness, then we can really sort of, reconsider, I suppose, things that might be happening around us or within us. So there's the body-based practices. Then there's the imagery-based practices. We might imagine a safe or calm place. We might begin to imagine a compassionate other, an ideal compassionate other, who comes and visits us for a while, and perhaps what might they have to say, or what might they do. I remember a recent person I was working with. We were doing that kind of compassionate other imagery, and it was Thor that came, because it was actually very interesting, because he had a lot of social anxiety, but he really wanted to socialize with his friends. And so he knew that the key sort of quality that he needed for that was going to be courage. So who better than Thor? So he created, I mean, he was a young guy, he was sort of into the Marvel thing, I guess. So he created this imagery around Thor as his compassionate other. And so he was creating a sort of imagery of this safe place where he would be visited by Thor. Thor would, sort of reassure him and encourage him, and he was able to go back out into the party, and all that sort of stuff. So we do the body-based stuff, we do the imagery-based stuff. We start to try to imagine a compassionate self as well, a compassionate self that's wise, strong, courageous, caring, helpful, and we start to then embody that compassionate self through various behavioral strategies. For example, I remember I did running a group with some veterans, and we talked about the compassionate self just before lunch, and off they went. I sort of said, at lunchtime, try to embody your compassionate self out there in the refec. And one of them came back and sort of said, it was really amazing. All I did was just lifted my chin, and suddenly the world kind of really opened up around me. I realized that I walk around with my head bowed and my furrowed brow, and but just lifting the chin was enough to kind of embody that more compassionate part of myself. And then we might go on to do things like chair work, or working with multiple selves, bringing the compassionate self to the anxious self or to the shamed self. And ultimately, the idea is we sort of learn about the compassionate mind, we practice the compassionate mind, and then gradually we might start to really embody the compassionate mind.
Like I can see two posters saying inhale and exhale behind your back,
Yes.
Breathing out. Beautiful. Yes, inhale and exhale. And surfing, is that you in the picture for surfing, or is it?
No, sadly,
beautiful,
I think that's a picture from maybe freedom or something like that, to be honest. But it does depict a couple of parts of me. The inhale exhale is definitely this idea of really, trying to the calm, compassionate mind. And then surfing is sort of a big deal as well. Just here I have my guitars, and over there I have my Batman comics, and basically that's me. Defined in my own home office.
Yeah, I remember that from the last time, because I could see the guitars in the background. Gosh, I can't believe we have been chatting for almost an hour. How time kind of flows by. Stan, I would like to have you back. Like today, we did a very nice overview of what CFT entails and what it looks like, but it feels like we were just scratching the surface. There is so much more to talk about, and particularly how might we take some of the learnings from CFT into people who are in suicidal distress, whether that be chronic suicidality or acute and chronic presentation, in terms, because often people in suicidal distress have a really harsh voice in their head. And we were just starting to get into the whole idea of self-criticism and how do we bring the tone of those voices down. And I would love to have most probably another session, this time maybe not with a 2.5 year gap, maybe
Yes.
sooner, because I have really become obsessed with trauma-informed care and what it means in kind of caring for those in suicidal distress. And I feel like every passing day, I feel CFD holds the answer in that space. So
I'd love to, Manaan, because it seems to me that there's different forms of self-criticism, isn't there? I mean, there are some forms that are more self-improving self-criticism, and we don't want to necessarily lose that either. But there are some that are self-hating, self-condemning, self-attacking, shame-based self-criticism. And I think it would be really interesting to reflect on how some of these ideas and concepts might fit in the work that you're doing with those who are kind of struggling with suicide and suicidal ideation. I think that'd be good.
Because for them, their emotional pain is such that the offer of life is essentially the offer of more pain. And of course, the interpretation of life, whatever the lens through which you're looking at, does that change over from offer of life to offer of pain? And what might compassion or the lack of it play in that interpretation? And which past experiences, belief systems is driving that? In your kind of diagram of those three systems, which system might be driving that interpretation? How could an offer of life become an offer of pain? And you can begin to conceptualize that when you look at the window of tolerance the person has got, and if the threat system is activated. Yes, of course, offer of life could be perceived as offer of more pain. But
and in terms of the trauma-informed bit too, we do have to be careful, because an offer of empathy or compassion can be very threat system activating too, especially if a person has had relational or attachment trauma or tragedy in their life, and all of a sudden caregivers are sort of associated with those who also hurt them. So I think it would be very interesting to unpack all of that.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Any last messages that you would want to give to our listeners before we end today?
Well, I like that 40-second thing that we mentioned earlier, that it as a compassionate person, but I wonder actually whether it might be when you're being compassionate towards others, but also when you're receiving compassion or self-compassion too, across the three flows, it might be trying to look at the little things to get started with, the brief 40-second words that you might share with a patient, or the little gestures from others that you might receive, like the chocolate milk or whatever it might be, and those little moments of self-compassion, doing a little act of kindness towards oneself. I think that's one thing for people to kind of percolate over, is that it can be the small things to begin with. And remember, I quote this in our MI workshops too, I suppose, but it's just come to mind again, Maya Angelou's quote about, people don't even really remember what you said or even what you do. They remember how you made them feel. And that's the tone piece. If we can help our patients and clients, and if we can help ourselves just to remember what it feels like to receive compassion, that's where we begin.
There you heard it, listeners. The small things that can make a big difference, how you made them feel like that. I think that is at the heart of it. Those little things, the tone of voice, that facial expression that they can read. I think genuine empathic concern gets through. People get it. If you are genuine about it, people get it. So thank you, Stan, for a stimulating hour that's just whizzed by, and would love to have you again at the Protect podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom so kindly and so graciously. Thank you very much, Stan.
Thank you. You did a wonderful job, and I look forward to being back.